the cash provided by the Guatemalan banks was originally put there as proceeds from drug traffickers who were doing business in Guatemala. That is one question I have about all of this is, Tom, you'll remember when the Justice Department earlier this year, announced its new, more constrained policies for when it would prosecute FCPA cases. They did say their very first circumstance where they would still go to the wall over enforcement would be if these cases somehow involved narco-trafficking. And at the time, I kind of wondered, what would that fact pattern look like? When would drug trafficking intersect with paying off a government official to win business if you're a foreign company? And it was kind of weird, and I couldn't figure it out. This is a fact pattern that fits that description. Now we know.
Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, back again with Matt Kelly for another episode of the award-winning Compliance Into the Weeds. Welcome back, Matt.
Hello, Tom. Good to be here.
Today, we're going to take up a rare FCPA enforcement action. We had one involving Millicom Cellular, which was announced last week. The DPA has apparently been released, and Matt's been able to get a copy of it. So we have a little more information. Matt blogged about it last week, and I'm sure he'll follow up, and I'm going to write about it when I get the DPA. So you want to set the stage, Matt?
Sure. Yes, to your point, this is a very traditional bread and butter FCPA enforcement action. The company in question is Millicom, which is a Luxembourg headquartered telecommunications business. They do cell phone service, things like that. They do it throughout Latin America, Central America, the Caribbean, places like that. So they have U.S. headquarters in Florida, and they do trade on the NASDAQ under the ticker TIGO or TIGO, I guess because that is the brand name for Millicom services in Central and Latin America. But what happened here was that last Monday, November 10th, I think the government was still shut down back then. I'm not quite sure. They somehow reached a settlement, and Millicom put out a press release to this effect, where Millicom was paying a $60 million criminal penalty, $58.2 million in disgorgement of ill-gotten profits, and a 2-year deferred prosecution agreement, annual progress reports to the Justice Department on the compliance program improvements Millicom has been making, is making. And also, I can say from having dug up the DPA about an hour ago, that the chief compliance officer and CCO of the subsidiary in question, I'll get to them in a moment, they must make a certification of the effectiveness of the compliance program at the end of the 2-year DPA. Tom, like I said, you and I have talked about that basic structure of FCPA enforcement action for years and years now. Therefore, I was somewhat surprised to see this because we can all recall that back in February, the Justice Department announced it would pause FCPA enforcement while it reconsidered its policies and priorities. Then in June, they lifted that pause, but they said that they would generally take a much more constrained approach to vigorous FCPA enforcement. And then, of course, we now have this deal. And so it looks like a traditional FCPA enforcement action. So I was kind of trying to figure out how all of that works. The other key players to keep in mind here are that Millicom is the parent company. The offending entity in question is its subsidiary in Guatemala called CommCell or CommCell, Comunicaciones Cellular. I can't do justice to the Spanish name, but CommCell, which operates in Guatemala, has operated there for many years, was a joint venture that Millicom owned with a subsidiary or a local partner in Central America in the 2010s. Although, get this, they were a majority partner, but did not have operational control or visibility. That's going to be a big deal. We can discuss in a bit. But CommCell was the messy joint venture in question. Ultimately, the Millicom took full control of CommCell in 2022 or 21, and we can go through the timeline and whatnot then, but, a messy case, a traditional enforcement action, and yet we were told that we would be seeing FCPA enforcement be very light touch, and this is not light touch at all. So here we are. Very interesting.
There's two components to this that I think take it out of the ordinary. The first was or is the self-disclosure by Millicom, I think around 2015, and a subsequent no action by the Department of Justice much later. And there were multiple years where Millicom was either, I guess, under investigation or hadn't been cleared. So we had a very long period of time where I think you called it purgatory, where Millicom didn't know its status and they were required to cooperate with the government. The second part, which you've been able to uncover with the DPA, are the facts around perhaps some either drug-related or cartel activity that the joint venture was apparently enmeshed in. So I wouldn't say the first part was a procedural history, but it's certainly unusual to have a 5 or 6 year period of no action or resulting in a no action and then have it bubble up later. So maybe could you walk us through that and what you saw as the significance of that to the eventual settlement we're talking about today?
Yeah, sure. That was really interesting. And Tom, put your thinking cap on while I walk listeners through this, because I can't recall that we've seen a pattern quite like this before. But what happened was that Millicom entered into this joint venture in Guatemala where they owned 55% of the joint venture, but did not have any operational control or visibility into the business in Guatemala, CommCell. But at some point, they realized by 2015 that corruption and bribery were afoot. We'll get to some examples of that later on. And so they self-disclosed to the Trump administration 1.0, or actually, I'm sorry, into the Obama administration in 2015. They disclosed to that Justice Department. The Justice Department in 2018, Trump 1.0, they decided to take no action. And the joint venture still existed in this, I called it a purgatory, because by then, Millicom knew that there was corruption going on in the joint venture. They had self-disclosed, but the joint venture, 2018, 2019, 2020, they still didn't have any visibility or control into it. And that is a point that they stressed multiple times in their press release last week, that they lacked operational control of the joint venture, even though they had already reported FCPA shenanigans in the joint venture. Finally, now, if you look at the statement of facts, you can see that by 2020, the Justice Department had learned that there was more corruption still ongoing at the joint venture. I'm not clear on how much Millicom knew or didn't know at that point. They took full control of the subsidiary in 2021, and then by 22, the Justice Department had reopened the previously closed investigation. Now, that's the part that, Tom, I don't know I've ever seen that before, that they reopened an investigation that had been deemed closed. But this settlement that we're talking about just now is based on the reopened investigation in 2022, once Millicom had full control over this CommCell subsidiary that they already knew it had trouble, but they, I guess, weren't necessarily sure how much. This does connect to drug traffickers, and we can talk about that too, which is, I think, how the Justice Department was keeping such close eye on this case. But like back and forth, and you need a flow chart or a timeline to keep straight of who was disclosing what and what was open when. It was a convoluted timeline here.
Did you get a sense from the DPA on whether or not the DOJ viewed this as a continuation of the 2015 self-disclosure, or was the subpoena issued in 2022 almost a new matter?
It's hard to say. That's a nice way of me saying I'm not sure. We can say that two of the characters involved in the bribery and corruption, two, I believe, Guatemalan nationals, but men who had helped CommCell in the 20s to bribe the Guatemalan government officials. One was a banker and one was another senior executive at Tigo Guatemala, or CommCell, in the joint venture. But those two executives were ultimately indicted by the Justice Department on corruption charges, convicted, and sentenced to prison. So that happened in the late 20s. I am guessing that maybe those two individuals then, maybe they provided more information, or maybe prosecutors, as a result of those cases, somehow gleaned more intel about the corruption that had gone on at CommCell. That would have been 20 and 21 or so. And then Millicom takes full control, finally, of CommCell. They get to see all of the bad stuff. They say, oh boy. And the case is at that point reopened. I don't know. It's a very blurry line between who knew what when. And, but I think that for our purposes, we could view this as one long case, because the lesson for other compliance officers really is how you can get into some horribly structured joint ventures, which this one certainly was, that leave you in a really weak compliance position, which Millicom found itself in. And then you wind up paying an awfully high price to clean up the mess at some point, which that point was last week.
So were the actions that led to the FCPA violation, the actual conduct, could you determine if that was for post 21, or was this all the way back to literally the first year of the last decade?
All the way back to the early 2000s. Apparently, some of the bribery was delivered in duffel bags of cash to Guatemalan government officials, and sometimes it was delivered directly to the Guatemalan officials' offices, to lawmakers who were structuring cellular communications laws in Guatemala. But duffel bags of cash sometimes delivered directly to the lawmakers. Sometimes the lawmakers went to the offices of CommCell, or Tigo as it is known. At one point, the duffel bags of cash were being ferreted around the country by helicopter, and private helicopter, of course. But the helicopter had to make an emergency landing in a military base, at which point the bagmen were caught literally taking bags of cash off the helicopter while it was being repaired. You don't want to leave cargo like that around a repair bay. And so some soldiers and military base officials saw the corruption there, reported it, and that was one incident. But after the helicopter scam was exposed, the gentlemen involved did realize that they needed to come up with a new way to get cash into lawmakers' hands, which then led to one of the bankers by the last name of Kobar, I believe, Kobar. He was working with a bank that would provide the actual cash that became the bribe money to the Guatemalan officials. Here's where the drug trafficking angle gets into play, is that the cash provided by the Guatemalan banks was originally put there as proceeds from drug traffickers who were doing business in Guatemala. That is one question I have about all of this, is, Tom, you'll remember when the Justice Department earlier this year, announced its new, more constrained policies for when it would prosecute FCPA cases. They did say their very first circumstance where they would still go to the wall over enforcement would be if these cases somehow involved narco-trafficking. And at the time, I kind of wondered, what would that fact pattern look like? Like, when would drug trafficking intersect with paying off a government official to win business if you're a foreign company? And it was kind of weird, and I couldn't figure it out. Okay, this is a fact pattern that fits that description. Now we know. As I said, the actual people who were working with the drug dealer were already convicted and sentenced to prison by U.S. authorities in the late 2010s. So again, was it that behavior fit into this new policy from the Trump 2.0 administration that led them to decide we're going to go for a criminal penalty? The money involved was significant. There were senior level executives at the Guatemalan subsidiary were directly involved in setting this up. It was their helicopters that were flying around the country with the bags of cash. So in many ways, the traditional prongs of you're in big FCPA trouble, they were all met by this case. Lots of money, senior people who were involved, consistent, knowing, deliberate, ongoing attempts at corruption. And yes, now also apparently drug money was being used, cleaned. I don't know, is it money laundering? If it's drug proceeds are laundered by turning them into a bribe, I'm not clear on what the laundering terminology is, but none of this.
The laundering.
Dirty laundry. I guess maybe they tried to launder it but failed. It went from one dirty form to another, but none of this looks good. And so I could see why, even in our much constrained FCPA enforcement climate, we still wind up with this really significant enforcement action even these days. This fits that profile.
So a couple of points. The first one is, unlike ISIS or Al-Qaeda, the designation of foreign terrorist of the cartels was not ideological based, but transaction based. So that led me to see the possibilities of having a FCPA action where there was drug cartel involvement because it's just transactions. One. Number two, though, is while there's not an FCPA enforcement action I can think of that is even close to this fact pattern, we did have several FCPA enforcement actions where the joint venture partner was a foreign government entity, and where we had foreign government entity control as low as 32%, we had an FCPA enforcement action, meaning no majority control. And the reality of those joint ventures is when you have a foreign government partner in a foreign country, they control. And so we have, I think, a series of discussions over the years on how do you protect yourself. And that was what your blog post brought up for me, is exactly that. How do you protect yourself in a joint venture in a situation where you don't have operational visibility? And what we used to say was try to get your guy or gal appointed as CFO so you can at least see where the money is. But I think you made clear in the blog post you wrote that this was the worst of all worlds, because with over 50% of ownership, no visibility, and apparently no one on the board who would protect the interests of the parent company.
No, that is all correct. And in fact, I kind of have to wonder, like, what did Millicom expect to happen when it was doing this? Now, let's remember that this would have been the first half of the twins, and okay, understanding of FCPA enforcement and risks were less mature than they are now, but they weren't absent. People still understood what the FCPA was, and I think by then they had understood that the Justice Department was for real about enforcing this. And yet still they engaged with this business partner. Now, the business partner, we can say, was, let me make sure I have the name correct here, was a company based in Panama named Miffin Associates, which was controlled by Mario Lopez Estrada, who was one of Guatemala's richest people. And Guatemala is a notoriously corrupt country that is overrun with drug trafficking. What did we think the risk was in getting into bed with a very rich and powerful person in a corrupt country that is also overrun by narco gangs? Like, obviously, this was going to be a risk. And still, somehow, Millicom decided to get into a joint venture with this business that did not give it any visibility into what was actually going on. And Mr. Estrada is known as Individual One or Shareholder One in the statement of facts, but it's clearly him. And he's all over this as being heavily involved in the corruption. It was his helicopters, apparently, that were ferrying around the duffel bags of cash. And his business partners are the two bankers and executives at the Guatemala subsidiary who wound up going to prison already. I have not yet had enough time to research exactly what Mr. Estrada is doing these days, but this was his deal that it was his business that was the minority partner that was engaged in all of this corruption. So I don't really know what else to say. That just stood out to me as who on earth at Millicom would have thought this was a good thing, that the juice was worth the squeeze. But here we are.
The other thing this case brought up for me, Matt, is around this new FTO designation by the Trump administration. You are required, if you're doing business in a country where these cartels are now designated as foreign terrorist organizations, you've got to increase and amp up your due diligence, because the point you raised a little bit earlier is this dirty laundering or money that was derived from the sale of drugs used to pay a bribe. What happens if the bank you think you're doing business with has that sort of dirty money and you get a hold of it in a loan or other proceed? I think under the FTO designation, you're going to be just as liable. So it really brought up for me the dangers of this transactional based approach that we're now in with drug cartels designated as foreign terrorist organizations.
You know, it's funny you mentioned that, because last week I moderated a webinar on cartel risk and its intersection with corruption. And this came up, that traditional FCPA due diligence understandings of who you would need to worry about and the due diligence you'd need to perform, like, they won't take you as far as you need to go with this expanded sort of a risk. Really you're worried about your overseas distributors, your agents, and a couple of others who are, they're the middlemen between you and the government, corrupt government official. But when you're worried about cartels, they could sneak into your supply chain in any number of ways. And a lot of times, they're not necessarily looking for a bribe to do business. They're looking for a mechanism to clean their money. So they're going to keep a very low profile because they want to keep the laundromat running. And that's not how corruption really works. Or, I mean, that's some of it, but there's more that you would have to worry about. You're going to have to perform due diligence on more people. You're going to probably have to perform it more often, I would say. You're going to have to think about your corruption risks, that they're going to be everything you would accept and understand for FCPA, and then more, because there might be different people who are running different sorts of scams because they're fundamentally trying to fulfill a different objective. They're not trying to win business. They're trying to clean their money, and you're the laundromat. So how do you keep that out of your house? And that's going to be hard. So yes, your FCPA due diligence is a good fundamental grounding in it, but it's just the fundamentals. There's a lot more you're going to have to do to keep these kind of risks in check.
Can I assume you're going to write a follow-up blog post based upon the DPA?
I was halfway through it when I hopped on this webinar now. I will have a second post on this later on tomorrow, I think. But I mean, it's a fascinating case.
Look forward to seeing what happens next week.